And now, ladies and gentlemen with the conference, for your keynote address, would you now please welcome Lord Howell of Guildford.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished and important audience here in the Mansion House. It always gives me a great pleasure to be addressing the IBBC and to bring my mind to the thoughts of your magnificent great nation and how it has been through many tribulations, but is adjusting, as we all are, to the modern and utterly transformed world in which we are now operating. I'm not going to comment in great detail on the many challenges facing your country, or indeed in detail on how, to take the slogan of the conference, how we all build Iraq, because the audience is full of people who know far more than I do about the details, and I've just been listening to the expert exchange of questions, and they're very exciting, but many of them are detailed and certainly beyond my everyday knowledge. Nor do I want to be the sort of politician who says, well, we agree on everything. Everything is going fine. I used to be teased when I was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Britain at the House of Commons that my speeches were all about warmer ties and closer links. And that's all I ever said. I'm going to go, today I hope I'll say some more interesting things about where Britain takes its new view about both your nation and your region, and indeed the world around you, as it is about us. And I'll give you a changing view of what is happening in British policy. Some, incidentally, have criticized the United Kingdom for alleged, shall we say, incoherence of direction and purpose in this age of international instability and uncertainty in which we now all live, in which all sorts of new forces are coming to the surface. Now, I'd reject that. I'd say that we're feeling our way in entirely new world conditions, in a fast-moving international scene, where certain trends have now hardened into new realities, which all modern and responsible nations, including Britain and including Iraq, must face. One, the age of blocks and institutional hierarchies is, I think, over in the digital age. The forces of decentralization, delegation, and identity are much too strong to fit into these old-fashioned ideas of great international hierarchies with bosses at the top and top nations and all that sort of thing. We maintain and seek very good neighbors here in Britain with the rest of the European, with the rest of the whole of the continent of Europe, and we're working at that in a bilateral sense all the time. But as you know, we left the bloc for many reasons, some of them good reasons, some bad, but a basic reality that this is not an age when everything can be conducted and developed in massive organizations which take long time to reach agreed positions and then often do nothing. We wanted a bit of freedom from that while remaining excellent neighbors with all our neighbors in Europe, but not a coherent fixed bloc, not too much tying us into treaties of the type which were structured in the 20th century and no longer fit into the 21st century. Second, the age of tying ourselves to apron strings treaties to others is also over. We used to talk a lot here in Britain about our special relationship with America. And of course, that goes back to the Second World War. But today we need a new kind of relationship with America, which we're trying to form, which is much more on lines of partners than being, as it were, following behind the boss. And partnership with America, a great nation, still immense energy and dynamism, is for us valuable, but it's not the same as following everything they do or agreeing with everything they do, and particularly not agreeing with the tendency, I think well-intentioned, of America to sort of see everything in black and white, Manichaean terms. The one moment it's good, the next moment it's evil. And this is not a way to conduct diplomacy in a complex world of changing views and opinions. Third, the age of everyone having to be in spheres of influence, much the fashion in the 20th century, is, I think, over. We have to be on our guard against the tendency for the really biggest nations. Russia is one, but China is an even bigger one, considerably richer than Russia. In fact, Russian economy is, I think, 1/10 the size of the Chinese economy now, or indeed the great United States, to think that every nation, yours and ours, can all be sort of neatly slotted into spheres of influence where we tend to follow the line from one particular source or another. Again, in this digital age, that's not the way the world works anymore. And nations are much more anxious to do their own thing and develop their own tailored relationships. This is the difference between hierarchies and networks. In a network, there isn't a hub at the center. There isn't a sort of boss figure. The network is endless dialogue and relationships between all countries, one hopes of a constructive and useful kind. So instead, we are moving into a world where like-minded coalitions need to be quickly formed to deal with specific issues. For instance, on climate. Obviously, the climate dangers are coming. Equally obviously, although not admitted by everybody, present policies are not going to stop very much. Emissions are going to go on rising worldwide, despite our efforts to reach net zero in many countries and our efforts to meet carbon emissions as best we can. It isn't going to work. So entirely new initiatives are now called for to counter the present carbon emissions, not by just capturing the emissions, but by, as the International Panel on Climate Change insists, now sucking or absorbing from the atmosphere carbon on a massive scale by entirely new worldwide initiatives, which will certainly involve this country, but even more will involve yours and all countries which can do more with brand new ideas, backed here by Imperial College, of which I'm very happy to talk, for absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere as part of developing entirely new ecosystems. All this lies ahead, and it's a new opening to the battle on climate change, which if we don't take, will bring us suffering and really colossal damage on a scale which we've never seen before. Second, on migration and movements of peoples, the world, sadly, is on the move. Its estimates are that 60 million people are in the mood or with the intention of migrating to other parts of their own countries or to other countries. This is an entirely new phenomenon which cannot be dealt with individually. We have to work all together to deal with that. Thirdly, on energy transition, this has got to be very gradual. There are those who say it's all got to happen tomorrow morning. It won't. And the attempt to make it happen too soon will simply create impossible imbalances, vast price spikes, huge volatility, and considerable suffering, particularly of the lower, poorer countries and the poorer income groups. This is the biggest shift since the Industrial Revolution, after 200 years of fossil fuels to move on. Actually, it's bigger than the Industrial Revolution, because remember, the population of the world then was about 1/10 of what it is now. So there's nothing that's ever happened on this scale before in human history. And the idea that it can be done by one country or even a little group called the West or anything else is pure folly. Then third, trade, investment, and development support, it needs to change its spirit, as it were. You'll now see coming from this country, from the United Kingdom, a far more distinctive kind of UK offer, aimed and tailored bilaterally to fit the hugely varying conditions and to help our friends in particular. And that's a reaction to a tendency in the past. We run here a big aid budget in the traditional sense, but there was a feeling that it was just being scattered about, not necessarily to friends in like-minded ways, but in a sort of with a casualness that was not delivering either development or the links and ties that responsible nations all want to see. Actually, in this country's case, in my country's case, we do have residual links, but very strong ones in many cases, with the Commonwealth, which is 54 like-minded nations, which across the globe pursue their own interests. Many are independent republics, but there is a commonality, tied particularly by our language, which we didn't plan, but that's the way it's developed, and it's a very useful asset for Britain, providing we recognize it as an asset and don't try and organize it to our own benefit. In this case, of course, China is nibbling away at that asset. You can read in the papers every morning how Chinese interest is growing in all those 54 countries and many others in Africa and Asia. China has 140 a Belt and Road Initiative memoranda of understanding with different countries around the world, 140 out of 191. So look out, that's rather a lot. Some of these are just very welcome memoranda bringing very valuable infrastructure. Some are bringing loans that are quite difficult to pay back. Some are bringing military training. Some are actually bringing propositions for new military and naval bases, as in the Solomons Islands recently reported. But that was last week. But if you read the papers this week, you'll read that China is now making overtures to Kiribati, Tuvalu, several other islands in the South Seas, and many other islands in the Caribbean as well as being heavily involved, sometimes constructively, sometimes less so, in many of our many nations across the whole world. And you, like we, must take a view. Some of Chinese effort and technology is valuable, some is dangerous. And we must all have, again, I think, a common exchange of views on how to handle the China problem is extraordinarily of interest to all of us trying to build our economies and modernize them for the new conditions. Finally, let me share some thoughts with you on the immediate present crisis of global energy prices, oil, gas, Russian exports, and the OPEC stance, of which you, of course, Iraq is a part. The late Sheikh Ahmedzaki Yamani, whose memory I shall be honoring at his foundation dinner tomorrow night, always argued that OPEC was a force for stability in oil markets and the world, really, in a sense, taking over from the old Seven Sisters regime that governed oil and oil stability and prices in the interwar years of the 20th century. I have no hesitation in saying that today, OPEC is a major source of instability in taking its current stance on production. If you don't agree with that, I'm sorry, but we can't agree with each other on everything. Arguing that oil markets are fundamentally balanced at the present output levels, plus I think a few 100,000 barrels per day they're planning, is in fact nonsense. There is nothing balanced about $120 oil or compelling European states to go on buying Russian oil and gas at this inflated price, thus directly ensuring the continued financing of Vladimir Putin's unprovoked war of butchery in Ukraine. Nothing balanced about that at all. Another 2 or 3 million barrels a day is easily and quite quickly available from the biggest producers, despite denials to that effect. And of course, Iran could add a further million barrels a day once the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA as it's called, is settled, which we all hope will be soon. The refusal to cooperate stance will bring much grief to all major OPEC producers. Demand for oil is anyway going to peak in 3 or 4 years' time, and oil intensity, that's the amount of oil you need to use per unit of product, is declining steadily and will continue to decline. So anyway, there is no genuine neutrality between orderly government on the one hand, which we all seek in all our countries, and vicious aggression by one state against another. That is the foundation principle of the modern world. So I leave it there. And I just end by saying that while the hot and ugly war continues in Ukraine, we are in fact all fighting many less visible but equally damaging and dangerous wars of an entirely new kind. There are intelligence and cyber wars, economic wars, sanctions wars, culture wars, fake news and propaganda wars, the wars of trying to uphold the rule of law against tyranny, as well, of course, as the climate wars which are coming, which are not fully supported around the world, and that leaves us all in danger, because unfortunately, if greenhouse gases grow, they don't respect national boundaries, they don't hover and stand back from the countries that are trying harder, and we're all threatened. All these issues are now being weaponized to use rivalries against each other, which we can't afford, and which must be subdued in a new framework of international cooperation. In all of these responsible nations, yours and ours, we have to work together as never before in history, or as Benjamin Franklin said grimly at the time of American independence, we have to hang together or we all hang separately. I pray and hope, friends, that nations such as mine, and nations such as the great modern Iraq, with all its terrific potential, can be as far as possible together and very close in this unending and immensely difficult and in many ways completely novel struggle. Thank you very much. Right. Do you want any questions? Any questions? I don't know. Who says questions? I'm always ready. I think questions are the better part of every speech, but someone else is controlling the time. I must be told to shut up or speak up. We have any takers for questions? Baroness, you're the boss of this. You tell me, can I answer questions? Or do you want me to sit down? What? Right. Will it do what? Sorry? When will it finish? I know. We don't know. There's so many schools of thought. One is, which is quite prevalent in our senior foreign policy experts' views, is that that somehow Russia must be defeated, and that driven completely out of Ukraine, that no territory must be surrendered. Indeed, the Crimea should be taken back into Ukraine, and that somehow Putin should be humiliated to the point almost of elimination. I think that's hope sort of understandable, but I do feel that's unrealistic. I think at some stage there is going to have to be negotiation. And the trouble is, it gets harder and harder. The more you hear Mr. Biden say that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, and he certainly got very nasty motives and actions, the more you talk in that way, the harder it is to find any basis of negotiation. I think it's right of President Zelensky to say, as a sort of initial negotiating position, that we're not going to surrender an inch of Ukrainian territory. That's a reasonable negotiating starting point, just as the Russian starting point presumably is going to be Putin's view that Ukraine should be eliminated from the map altogether. These are absurd positions and so far apart, you couldn't even find anything on which to negotiate between them. But I think through the agency of time and new arrangements for Luhansk and Donetsk, which the Russia thinks are independent, and Kiev thinks, Ukraine thinks are a part of Ukraine. Maybe some compromise over this, stretching years ahead, is possible. But at the moment, it's very hard to see. Both sides are too strong to be defeated, but too weak to defeat the other side. That's the awful dilemma. So I'm afraid a long haul, many false starts, and maybe at the end of it, some sort of patched agreement that the killing should stop. But it leaves a very nasty stain on our world as a whole, a very nasty stain on humanity, and I don't think everything is ever going to be the same again. We are in a world of international instability, driven by populist forces that have been greatly dynamized by one simple thing, the little microchip, which has given everybody the feeling that their identity matters, their mobile, their iPad can challenge every government, and that every group should have its say against every other group. And that makes government extremely hard in your country, and in this country as well, and in the United States, and even in the authoritarian tyrannies such as Russia and China. They too are not free from this populist surge which dominates world affairs. So they're an unhelpful and long answer. There isn't really an answer in that at the moment. Anyone else want to have a go? No? Yes, please. There's one there, one there. But I need a glass of water, please. Thank you. No. I'll just get a glass of water.
Thank you, Lord Howell, for your excellent speech. I'm a long-term admirer of your contribution and thoughts, but I find it quite challenging to accept your comments on OPEC, to hold it as kind of like contributor to instability, because of one or two countries may have kind of like spare capacity, even though these kind of like spare capacity is kind of like conditional. We know we know very well that Iran, for example, restriction is because of the sanctions. So there is a big if. Yeah. Once that if is served in terms of like reaching a nuclear deal, then they have that spare capacity to contribute. Other countries is, even though like if Saudi Arabia, they have like for limited time to serve such capacity. But again, in my humble opinion, OPEC and OPEC Plus in general, specifically since 2016 until this very moment, contributed quite significantly to energy security and the stability of oil prices. Needless to say that international oil companies needed a better understanding of pricing to budget for their projects and to forecast for further development. Today's investment in the oil and gas industry is much less than what it was 10 years ago, while the growth and demand for energy remains to be a big issue to serve as we go through this energy transition. As for the net zero emission, this is the view of the IEA, but again, this could be rebutted by other producers to say net zero emission could remain to be like an aspiration to be served, but we all agree that lowering carbon emission should be like a priority. And to make sure that extracting hydrocarbon should be in the most sustainable way to maintain economic and energy stability across the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, we all agree. In the past, OPEC, I agree with Yamani and I agree with you, was a stabilizing force. But it was always challenged, as we all were, by sudden international, unpredictable, violent events. And we are now in one of those, where there is instability and where the challenge is for OPEC as much as everybody else. I mean, look at the maths. OPEC, Saudis said the other day they got 2.3 million barrels of spare capacity. I see that's denied this morning by the chair of Aramco, who says it's all very difficult and they haven't, and so on. But I think that's probably what they've got. I think the UAE has got about another 500,000. I don't know about Kuwait. I do know, as I said, Iran has got at least 1 million to put in when their politics of the JCPOA are settled. And I do know that in America, Mr. Biden, after facing both ways, once saying he wanted to go for net zero and close down the shale oil and gas, and now saying the opposite, that he wants to open up the shale oil and gas and let Wall Street get them off the hook and start investing again. Eventually, that will happen, and America will be back to its 12 and 13 million barrels a day of production, which they didn't have before. So if you add all that up, you're well ahead of Russian cuts on oil to Europe. And even if the Russians do cut off all their 3 million barrels a day to Europe, plus their gas, and that I agree is much more difficult, that oil will go to Asia, and is going to Asia already at a considerable discount. The Chinese are buying Russian oil. You can move oil around from from west to east in a way that you can't move gas around because the pipelines have to be built. So that's the particular immediate situation causing the huge volatility. And I would hope for a bit more cooperation and understanding on that than we have at present. In fact, I would say that if you want to ease the situation, if you want to put pressure on Russia to stop financing its horrors, if you want to ease the really ugly drivers of inflation, which will hurt everybody, and undermine political stability everywhere, if you want to do that, we do need, in the short term, to pump more oil and gas. To me, it's a supply problem. It's not a demand problem at the moment. I'm more with Lord Keynes, the late Lord Keynes, on this than I am with some of these monetarist experts today who think it's just a question of shoving up interest rates and, hey presto, and putting on woolly sweaters to cut your heating bills, and demand will calm down and with it the prices. That's nonsense to me. The real truth is that supply must increase, and I do want OPEC to realize that they can contribute to this in the short term. Longer term, I agree, investment or lack of investment in oil is dangerous, because it means that as oil peaks and begins to go down over the next 30 years, demand will stay ahead of supply, and you'll get more spikes, volatile price spikes like we've got now. And these are very, very dangerous things. So my plea would be, with great respect to those who have got the capacity in the short term, please could they use it, as our friends from Qatar incidentally are using on gas. There's no problem on gas at the moment. Our ports here are stuffed with ships queuing up, full of LNG, and trying to find places to land it. They can't do it because our storage decisions were rotten. We failed to have adequate storage provisions here, and our pipes are full for our local trunk grid, and we haven't got enough pipes to pipe across to the continent. And the Germans forgot to build any gas degasification receipt terminals at Bremerhaven or Kiev or Kiel or so on, so they can't take it except by pipe. So a lot of this is just sheer incompetence in the distribution system, and it's imposing great pressures and really horrific suffering. Can we eat, or can we eat, or can we heat? How do we look after our children? How do we fill the gas meter so it doesn't run out? These are desperate situations, and caused by all this bad planning. So that's my position, and that's why I feel we should solve it all by the simple way: if you can't do anything about demand, then increase supply.
Colleagues and friends, I ask you to thank Lord Howell of Guildford very, very warmly indeed. He's our Vice President, and we're deeply grateful to him for coming. As of course you've realised, he is the most eminent foreign policy politician in the UK, and of course you won't have missed the fact that in the staircase here we have some of the most brilliant ancient paintings of the Netherlands, Holland. And of course, in that era, which is 1500 or so, those windmills, those little windmills in those paintings are absolutely invaluable. But personally, I've never felt that windmills now will actually make any difference to energy at all. So I support his position completely. We need oil and gas, and we need oil and gas responsibly cleaned up as it goes, and that's where the big companies do so well. Lord Howell, David, thank you very, very much indeed for being our Vice President and for being with us today and for all that you've taught us. Thank you so much.
So could I have the second set of panelists straight